Most people think being a police detective is about big moments, dramatic arrests, intense interrogations, and solving cases just in time, but the reality is something very different, something slower, heavier, and far more mentally demanding than anything you see on screen, because real investigations don't move at the speed of entertainment. They move at the speed of evidence, and evidence doesn't always cooperate, so the day begins not with excitement, but with responsibility. Sometimes with an alarm clock cutting through the early morning silence, and sometimes with a phone vibrating before the sun has even had a chance to rise. And on days like this, it's the phone that starts everything. A call that immediately shifts the mind into work mode, dispatch on the other end speaking quickly, but clearly giving just enough information to know that something serious has happened, a reported break-in, possible assault, the kind of situation that leaves more questions than answers. And before the detective even gets out of bed, the process has already begun, thoughts forming, scenarios playing out, wondering whether this was random or targeted, whether the victim knew the attacker, whether this is connected to anything else. Currently under investigation, because a detective doesn't just react, they anticipate, they analyze, they begin building the case before they've even arrived, and within minutes the routine of getting ready is stripped down to the essentials. Because time matters. Every minute that passes is a minute where evidence can be lost, memories can fade, suspects can move further away, and by the time the detective steps into the station, the building is already alive with motion. Officers finishing overnight shifts, voices overlapping, radios crackling, paperwork being passed from one set of hands to another, and there's a rhythm to it all. A controlled chaos that only makes sense if you've lived inside it, and the detective moves through it without hesitation, grabbing coffee not because there's time to enjoy it, but because the day will demand focus that can't afford to slip. Then sitting down at a desk that holds more than just one case, because there is never just one case, there are always several, each with its own timeline, its own weight, its own expectation that it will be solved. And the first task is always the same: check everything, every email, every report, every update that came in overnight, because investigations don't stop when the detective goes home. They continue through lab work, through patrol activity, through witnesses deciding they're ready to talk, and sometimes the smallest update can change everything. A fingerprint match that wasn't there before, a piece of surveillance footage that finally shows something useful, a name that appears where it hadn't previously, and each piece gets reviewed carefully because rushing through information is one of the fastest ways to miss something critical. And after about an hour of sorting through all of this, the detective stands up, knowing it's time to go to the scene, because information on paper is only part of the picture. The rest has to be seen firsthand, and when they arrive, the area is already secured, patrol units keeping the perimeter, tape stretched across entry points, and stepping under that tape is like stepping into a different space entirely. One where something has gone wrong, and it's now the detective's job to understand exactly how and why. And the process begins with observation, slow, deliberate, methodical, scanning every inch of the environment, starting with the obvious. Points of entry, the door, the lock, the frame, looking for signs of forced access, scratches, splintering, anything that suggests how someone got inside. Then moving to windows, checking for broken glass, disturbed dirt, footprints that might still be visible if they haven't been contaminated yet. And inside the scene holds its own story, furniture out of place, items missing or left untouched. And the detective has to interpret all of it, because the difference between a random break-in and a targeted attack often lies in these details. Was anything of value taken, or was the focus on something specific? Was the space searched quickly or carefully? And while forensics begins collecting physical evidence, fingerprints, DNA samples, trace materials that could link a suspect to the scene, the detective is already building a narrative in their head, a timeline of events, estimating when this likely occurred, how long it lasted, what the suspect's intentions might have been. And then comes the human element, speaking to the victim if they're able, listening carefully not just to the words but to the emotion behind them, because trauma affects memory. People don't always recall events in a clear or linear way. So the detective asks questions patiently, allowing the story to unfold, then circling back to clarify details. Not to challenge, but to ensure accuracy, because accuracy is everything, and from there it's on to witnesses, neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual, and most of the time what they have to offer seems small, a noise. In the night, a car passing by, a shadow moving where it shouldn't have been. But sometimes those small details become the turning point of the entire case, and this part of the job requires a different kind of focus, one that isn't about physical evidence, but about people, about understanding how they communicate, how they remember, how they might unintentionally leave out something important, and hours can pass in this phase alone, moving from one conversation to another, piecing together fragments that may or may not connect, and by the time the detective steps away from the scene, it's already early afternoon. And while technically this is when most people would take a break, that doesn't really exist here. Instead, the work transitions into organization, sitting down with notes, rewriting them, building timelines, mapping out who was where and when, identifying inconsistencies, because investigations are as much about structure as they are about discovery. And as everything is laid out, patterns begin to emerge. Certain names start to stand out. Individuals with prior records, people connected to the victim, anyone who might have had a reason or an opportunity. And these leads are followed systematically, running names through databases, checking histories, looking for overlaps with other cases, because crime rarely exists in isolation. And sometimes, a name that seems insignificant at first becomes central once it's placed in the right context, and this leads to more movement, more action, traveling to different locations, knocking on doors, asking questions, confirming alibis. And sometimes it leads nowhere, hours spent chasing something that turns out to be irrelevant. But even that has value because every eliminated possibility narrows the field, brings the investigation closer to something real, something that can actually be proven. And as the afternoon turns into evening, the detective begins focusing on one lead that keeps resurfacing, a name that appears in records, in proximity reports, in small but consistent ways that are difficult to ignore. And this is where instinct begins to merge with evidence, where experience starts to guide attention. And the detective decides it's time to bring that person in for questioning, not because guilt has been established, but because the pattern is too strong to dismiss. And as that decision is made, the day shifts again, moving toward the next phase, one that requires a completely different kind of focus. One that doesn't rely on physical evidence or witness accounts, but on conversation, observation, and control. And as the suspect is located and brought into the station, placed into a quiet room with nothing but a table and 2 chairs, the detective prepares for what might be the most delicate part of the entire process, knowing that what happens next could either move the case forward in a meaningful way or set it back entirely, depending on how it's handled. And as the detective steps into the room, the atmosphere is immediately different from everything that came before. Quieter, more focused, more contained, because now the investigation isn't spread across locations or people or evidence. It's concentrated into a single interaction, one person across the table whose words, reactions, and behavior could determine the direction of the entire case. And the detective doesn't begin with accusations or pressure, instead starting with something simple, a conversation that feels almost ordinary, asking basic questions, establishing a baseline. Because understanding how someone behaves when they are comfortable is the only way to recognize when that behavior changes, and over time the questions become more specific, slowly narrowing in on details that matter, asking about whereabouts, timelines, relationships, and watching carefully for any signs of hesitation or inconsistency. Because people rarely present contradictions in obvious ways. More often it's subtle, a pause that lasts a little too long, a detail that shifts slightly from one answer to the next, and the detective takes mental note of all of it, not reacting immediately, but storing it, building a picture that will be tested over time. And this process can take hours, sometimes stretching late into the evening, because the goal isn't to force a confession or create tension, it's to uncover truth. And truth doesn't respond well to pressure. It reveals itself through patience, through repetition, through careful observation, and sometimes that patience pays off, not with a dramatic moment, but with a small crack in the story, a detail that doesn't fit, a timeline that no longer aligns with the evidence. And that's when the detective begins to apply more pressure, not aggressively, but deliberately, bringing up inconsistencies, asking for clarification, giving the person a chance to explain, and often the explanations only create more gaps, more contradictions, until the weight of it becomes difficult to maintain, and in some cases that leads to admissions, not always a full confession, but enough to shift the case forward, enough to justify further action. And once the interview concludes, the detective steps out of the room, not with a sense of finality, but with more work to do, because everything that was said now has to be compared against the evidence. against the timeline, against the statements of others, and this is where the investigation either strengthens or weakens depending on how well everything aligns, and regardless of the outcome, the documentation begins writing reports that captures every detail of the interaction, every question asked, every response given, because in the legal system, memory isn't enough. Everything must be recorded, preserved, and presented accurately, and as this process continues, the hours keep moving forward. The station growing quieter as other officers finish their shifts and head home, but the detective remains, reviewing everything once more, checking for anything that might have been overlooked, because even after a full day of work, the possibility of missing something is always there, and that's a risk that can't be ignored. And sometimes, just when it feels like nothing more can be done, something changes. A new piece of information comes in, a lab result confirming a connection, a witness calling back with a detail they remembered after the fact, something that ties directly into what was uncovered earlier in the day, and suddenly, the case moves again, the pieces beginning to fit together in a way they hadn't before. And this is where the job shifts from uncertainty to direction, where decisions can be made with confidence, where actions can be taken that are backed by evidence rather than assumption. And depending on what that evidence shows, it might lead to an arrest, or it might lead to another line of questioning, another day of work that continues the process, because not every case resolves quickly. Some take days, weeks, even months to fully understand, and the detective has to be prepared for that. Prepared for the long process, the repeated effort, the constant need to reassess and adapt, and eventually, when the day finally reaches its end, the detective gathers everything. Notes, reports, evidence summaries, organizing it in a way that allows the work to continue seamlessly the next day. Because there is no true reset, no clean break between one day and the next, only a continuation of the same responsibility, and as they leave the station and step back into the outside world, there is a contrast that's impossible to ignore. The normalcy of everyday life continuing as if nothing happened, while inside the detective carries the weight of everything they've seen, everything they've worked on, everything that still remains unresolved, and even as they head home, the mind doesn't fully disconnect, still replaying moments from the day, reconsidering details, thinking about what could be done differently, what still needs to be done, because being a police detective isn't something that turns off at the end of a shift. It stays with you in the way you think, in the way you observe the world, in the constant awareness that every case represents something real. Something that matters, and that responsibility doesn't fade when the day ends. It simply carries over into the next one, where the process begins again, not from the beginning, but from wherever it left off, continuing forward, step by step, piece by piece, until eventually the truth is found or the search continues, because that's the nature of the work, ongoing, demanding, and always focused on one goal, finding out what really happened and making sure it holds up when it matters. Most